In this video, we cover specular samples. Basically, using specular samples, you can control the quality of the indirect rough specular reflections. When a camera ray hits a surface with rough speculars, or you might say blurry reflections, at the hit point, specular rays will be generated and the number of those rays can be controlled using specular samples. So you increase this value to reduce the amount of indirect specular noise. This is the scene that we have, and if I open up the chrome material that I have applied to the sphere, you can see the metalness value is set to 1. That's why we are getting this chrome-like shader. Also, the roughness value in the specular section is set to 0.2, and this is why we get this rough or blurry specular reflections. And if I zero it out, we would have a sharp specular reflection. There is also this gold material. I'm using the metal material preset and the metal preset is set to gold. At this point, you don't need to know how to create these materials, just know that they have some rough specular reflections. Let me get out of the camera. You can see we have these 3 area lights that you can clearly see their reflections on the reflective objects. The render you see is generated based on the default sampling settings. If I open up the render setting window, let's set all the sample values except for the specular samples to 1, and let's leave our specular samples at 2. Now I'm going to enable IPR, and this is the render that we get. Just so you know, I have progressive refinement in my render settings enabled for IPR, and progressive render is enabled in the IPR window as well. You can check out the IPR lesson in the rendering section of the course if you want more info about the IPR window and how it works. Also, the IPR scale is set to 50% of the final resolution that is defined in the Output tab in the render settings. Like the previous video, let's go to the AOVs and add direct and indirect specular and diffuse. If I zero out specular samples, as you can see immediately, we lose any indirect specular reflections in our scene. I'm going to increase specular samples to 1, and as I do that, we get our indirect speculars back. Specular samples here represents a secondary indirect ray type, not a direct primary ray type. That's why even when I zero out my specular samples, I still can see direct reflections in the scene. We still can see the reflections of the area light on our objects. As I increase specular samples, we are going to get higher quality indirect specular reflections. I'm going to set the specular samples to 0. As you can see, because we don't have any specular samples, there would be no indirect specular reflections, but we still can see the direct speculars from the area lights. And if I take a look at the direct and indirect specular AOVs, you see the indirect specular pass is completely black, and the direct reflections of the quad lights are visible in the direct specular pass. Let's increase our specular samples to 1. We start to see indirect speculars. You see the reflections of the backdrop object in the objects and also the reflections of the objects in each other. But the whole render and the specular reflections are very noisy, especially if we take a look at the specular indirect pass, you see how noisy it is. For the next render, let's increase the specular samples to 6, and as you can see, we don't have any noticeable noise in our indirect specular reflections. We can take a look at the specular indirect AOV for this render. Increasing the specular samples has made this pass very clean. But as it is obvious, the quality of direct specular reflections from the area lights didn't improve by increasing the specular samples, because these are direct reflections from the light sources, and we need to increase our light samples to compensate and get rid of them. So let's select all the lights and increase the light samples from 1 to 4. You need to select the lights, go to the main tab, and increase the samples from 1 to 4. And this is the render we are going to get. It's much cleaner compared to the previous render. The direct specular reflections from the lights have cleared. As you can see, by increasing the light samples, we have decreased the noise in the direct specular pass. There are still some noise in the indirect specular pass, very slight, but in a moment we are going to increase our camera samples and would have a cleaner pass. Also, we need to increase our diffuse samples to clean up the noise in the indirect diffuse pass. I'm going to increase the camera samples to 4, diffuse samples to 4, And because we have increased our camera samples, now we have a much bigger specular samples. So we can probably decrease the specular samples to something like 4. And now if we wait for the IPR, now we get this very, very clean render. The only problem is this abstract object that has a material with subsurface scattering applied to. That's why we need to increase the SSS samples or subsurface scattering samples to about 6. We talk about SSS and SSS samples later on in the course. Now let's see what we get as our final render. And here is our final clean render. As a final note, let me tell you that for the specular samples like diffuse transmission, SSS, volume indirect, light samples, the actual number of samples are input values squared multiplied by the square of the camera sample. So even though we only have 4 specular samples, but if you take a look at the actual specular samples up here, it's 272. So in this lesson, we discussed specular samples, and in the next one, we talk about transmission samples.